Hello, everyone. It's our first live meeting at IM Tech, and we are very honored to have um, who else but our very own Rob Bath, who is going to do overcoming the challenge of managing records in Microsoft 365, an area of discussion that is very important and affects everybody in our professional network. This one. So, without further ado, just so we can maximize the information that Rob is going to impart today, I'm handing over to Rob.
Hi everyone. I'll give a few more minutes while other people join the call. But yes, as Maria says, I'm really thank you, Maria, for inviting me to speak to the IM Tech group today. And I'll be speaking on the subject. Hi Alex. So feel free to say hi to each other in chat. But today I'll be speaking, as Maria quite rightly says, on the subject of overcoming the challenges of managing records in Microsoft 365. And just a disclaimer before I go too far in, I can't possibly solve all of the challenges of managing records in Microsoft 365 in a single call, but I'm going to try and focus on some of the more pressing and more pertinent challenges. Do hope you can all see my screen. Before I go in to any detail, before I start the presentation, really, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, I recognise we've got quite a lot of people on this call already. I'm really glad to see such a large group of people here. I'm certain that many of you will be IRMS members, but I'm sure there's also a good chunk of you who probably aren't IRMS members. So I'd just like to say, for those of you who are not familiar with the IRMS, it's the Information and Records Management Society, and they are a voluntary organisation, that I'm heavily involved with. But the quality of the information that they provide to their members is really, really strong. If you're not already a member, please consider joining up, because a lot of information just like this sort of thing is behind the paywall. So, once you're a member, you get access to a wealth of knowledge and information, and to the IRMS Bulletin magazine. So yes, Ren's just posted in chat a join up link for anyone who's not a member. Please do consider joining. It's only £90. It's not that much. Anyway, that's the first little piece of housekeeping. I can see there's more people still joining the meeting.
More housekeeping, Rob. I forgot to ask. How would you want to deal with a question? Will you be? I'll monitor the chat lines and then ask you the questions
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
we have a break, or anytime. You're okay with any time there's a question?
Yeah, absolutely. We can do it on the fly, but I've got a section at the end where we can sort of batch together any questions, Maria, if useful. Yeah. But certainly if they're pertinent to what I'm saying, at any stage when it makes sense.
So if you have any questions to the specific topic being currently discussed, put them on the chat and we'll ask them from Rob.
Absolutely. The next thing I want to mention is this is a sponsored event. It's sponsored by Orinoco 365. More about that later. Don't worry, it's not going to be too heavily salesy. I'll come on to Orinoco at the end of the session. But just wanted to mention that I'll be doing the same session in 2 days' time at the IRMS Roadshow in Glasgow. So, if anyone happens to be in Glasgow, you can feel free to come along, ask me questions directly face to face, and more than happy to try and answer problems, etc., and issues and any questions you happen to have when for those people who are coming along to that event in Glasgow. Okay, should we just get going? Let's get going. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Rob. I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect, and I very much focus on the gap, I guess, between the IT community and the information management and records management community. I've done nothing really in the last 10 years other than laser focus upon retention and information management inside the context of Microsoft 365. So I'm hoping that today's session is going to be relevant, and I'm hoping that I can start sort of helping some of you with technical hoops. I'm the founding director of Orinoco, as I said, more on that later. I'm also work for a company called Intelligy, where I run their knowledge and information management practice. So feel free to reach out at any stage, if you want guidance around anything related to Microsoft 365. Okay, so I'm sure many of you will recognize this sort of outline document management lifecycle. You know, content gets created, content then gets stored throughout a period where people need to collaborate on that information, and also when you want to be making sure that retention is being adequately applied to the content that's being stored. Then typically in most organizations, the majority of information needs to go through some form of disposal process, probably something like 60%, I guess, on average, gets automatically deleted or should be automatically deleted at the end of the retention period. Some organizations also have review processes whereby the remaining, often more valuable content or more sensitive content goes through some form of disposition review. Very often the decision that's taken there is either to dispose that content or perhaps to transfer it maybe to a digital preservation tool or archive. Now, I'm guessing that this is familiar to most of you. This is 101 sort of information management stuff. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is because there are challenges throughout this life cycle when it comes to managing records in Microsoft 365. Now, I guess just to be really clear, Microsoft 365, Microsoft provides a wealth of capabilities. We've probably never had it so good. There are so many really robust capabilities that Microsoft's providing us with now. Just as an example, if we went back 4 years, just being able to manage records in situ inside Outlook, just wasn't really a capability. This is the first time we're in a position where we're talking about being able to manage records directly inside the context of Outlook. What we've got is a really powerful and rich set of tools. It's just, I guess, part of that power, part of the wealth that Microsoft's provided us with means that they really are sometimes quite complex to get your head around and quite complex to work out how to appropriately use and configure inside your environments. So these are some of the challenges. These are certainly not all of the challenges, but these are some of the challenges that I've identified as being perhaps some of the most pertinent challenges inside Microsoft 365 that we all need to start considering. Let's just pick a couple. So how can we ensure that staff can easily find information stored inside Microsoft 365? Well, this is very much about making sure that you're classifying your content well. The better your classification, and by classification, I don't mean classification that's useful for you to make governance decisions, although that's really, really important too. I'm really talking about thinking about getting classification that makes it easier for staff to find and identify the right types of content. Think about it from a usability and search experience perspective. I think that getting that metadata applied to your content is the way to get a really rich and powerful search experience that's going to help people find the content effectively. Obviously, you need to, it's easier said than done. You need to make sure that you are applying consistent classification, probably by default, and encouraging staff to reclassify more appropriately. Let's pick another one. How can we safely share content externally? There's lots of different approaches to this, but I can tell you the worst approach is to the very worst approach is to allow staff to use shadow IT, Dropbox, Box, or any of these other things. If they're popping up in the sides of your organization, be worried. You've got to start trying to provide them with more appropriate ways of sharing content in a safe and structured manner. Likewise, if people are perhaps sharing things as attachments inside Outlook, you really want to try and discourage that behavior. I've seen some organizations build their SharePoint architectures where they lock down all of the permissions, prevent external sharing across almost all of their sites, and perhaps provide a single central sharing location. This approach can work, but you're naturally going to lead to content duplication. People will create the file, the record in one location, then we'll duplicate it to the sharing location. And of course, we all know that we're trying to avoid content duplication wherever possible. And just at this point, we've just gone past 200 people on this call. I'm really chuffed. Thank you all for being here. But yeah, we all know we need to avoid content duplication. But to me, probably the best approach is to accept that staff just need to be able to use the system they've got access to. If you consider perhaps allowing external sharing and encouraging external sharing in situ across not all, but the majority of your sites. Certainly you're not going to want to, allow external sharing in any site containing anything that's, very confidential or very, very sensitive. For example, you're not going to want your employee records shared externally, I would imagine, in most contexts. But if you perhaps move to an architecture where the majority of your sites are a label external sharing, and perhaps you focus your efforts on trying to identify and run audit processes of who has access to this outside the organization at this, and periodically review that, I think that's probably a better use of your time and resources. Anyway, we can't solve all of these. What I want to do at this stage is put up a poll, get your feedback. Let's test this. This is a real experiment, and I'll see how this works because I have no idea how this is going to work. I'm hoping right now you can see a poll on your screen. I'm hoping that we'll start getting some feedback into that poll.
Yes.
And start seeing, brilliant, okay. Please feel free to scan through this list. Now, obviously, this isn't every potential challenge that you might be facing in Microsoft 365. I've arbitrarily picked some of the ones that I think are more pertinent, more pressing for the community. Please let us know. And the reason that I'm putting this poll together is really because, we've got an opportunity at the RMS to come back at some stage in the future and hopefully run another session like this where we could actually dive into one of these. If let's say one of these is starting to become really popular, really pressing, then we've got an opportunity to understand that in more detail and start, running future sessions on it. I'm already seeing from the results.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad it's working. It's a technical risk. But SharePoint and Teams retention seems to be coming out towards the top. And then we have finding content easily, so that search experience. Obviously, things are changing in the live experience here, but disposition review and email retention are also coming towards the top, which is really, really interesting to me because I think, future sessions maybe where we could dive into how do you solve a problem like, retention when it comes to email, or how do you think about disposition review. It could be really important.
It's not Maria, Rob, so that's good. So I'm saying that there are people who's like, everything, they're all my problems. So maybe like all of it, kind of a scenario on the chat line.
Okay, well, perhaps we need a session on everything, but we'll take our time, we'll work through them, but we'll start, I think, with some of the more pertinent and pressing of these. But let's actually start. And actually, I'm really chuffed actually you picked the retention in Teams and SharePoint because I think that's one of the ones that I want to focus on in today's session. But firstly, the first thing I wanted to pick out on wasn't one that I listed in the poll at all, but it was, how do I, as an information management professional, how do I get to influence what's happening in Microsoft 365? Too often I walk into organizations and see people who are informational records managers just simply not empowered to make decisions around Microsoft 365 and the usage of the tenant. Very often it's someone in IT who's run a migration or set up the the structure of SharePoint sites and then throws it over to the records management team and says, there you go and sort of scatter your retention capabilities over the top of all of this. It doesn't work that way. You fundamentally need to be in charge of defining the architecture. You need to really be in the driving seat, if you like. I'm not saying necessarily being the sole drivers of the platform, because there's other people who have a really important say in usage of Microsoft 365. For example, your information security team absolutely need to be at that table too. But as information management and records management and information governance professionals, I think it's really important that you're almost considered to be amongst the group of really important stakeholders who control Microsoft 365. And as part of that process, I would suggest if you don't feel empowered already, really work inside your organization to set up roles and responsibilities, some form of matrix of ownership and responsibilities around Microsoft 365. For example, who is responsible for reviewing changes that Microsoft's making to the roadmap? How are they being monitored? How is that change being communicated? You really need to be thinking about all of these things from an information management perspective, not just initially when you're setting up the structures and the architectures that you want people to work in, but ongoing too. And this leads me to the next big challenge, which in the poll results, I haven't actually looked at the updated poll. Let me just flick back over and have a look, see if it's still, yes, it's still top of the poll at the moment. But how do we reliably apply retention across SharePoint and Teams really has jumped to the top of the poll, and it's going to be what I'm really going to focus most of the rest of this session on. We just asked Copilot to do this for me all the time. Yeah, Copilot's wonderful, and obviously there's lots of sessions on Copilot. We certainly are very interested in talking more about Microsoft's growing AI capabilities. I think that's a fascinating, topic to go into. But in terms of reliably applying retention across Microsoft SharePoint and Teams, there are a number of different capabilities that you've got access to, and I think it's important to understand the different approaches that you have and the different decisions that you might want to make when you're planning that architecture. So firstly, I'm going to focus on retention labels. I'm biased. I know there's several people out there, and many people who are fans of retention policies, and I haven't forgotten them. I just feel that retention labels have all of the benefits with none of the drawbacks of retention policies. Retention policies fundamentally, for me, are going to make it difficult for an organization to comply with GDPR. If you are using a retention policy in retention mode, then every time a user clicks delete on a specific record, it is caught and held behind the scenes for the remainder of the retention period in a location called the preservation hold library. And it's very difficult. It's not impossible. It's very difficult to remove that item once it falls into the preservation hold library. Meaning that, let's say you've legitimately deleted something under GDPR's right to be forgotten, or because it contains personal information or credit card details, the end user doesn't realize that that's being caught and held behind the scenes, and you still need to return it from a e-discovery or from an information rights request. It's still your content. You're still possessing it. It's still something that you need to be able to show back to the in your reports. So I would urge you to avoid using retention policies and use retention labels wherever possible. Okay, looking at retention labels and the options that we've got here. The first option that you've got when it comes to retention labels is the manual application of retention labels. Now, I know what you're thinking. You get people to classify things manually, it's just never going to be highly effective. It's never going to really work. That said, I have seen it work in some organizations. I think, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't recommend storing any sensitive content in highly sensitive. Certainly if you're the sort of organization that processes, say, things that might fall under the UK government's secret classification, certainly in Microsoft 365 is not the place. Official and official sensitive, absolutely. Yes, absolutely agree with that. When it comes to manual classification, users, let me give you an example of where it has worked. So, for example, I once saw in a fairly small pharmaceutical organization, focused heavily on clinical drug trials. It worked effectively there because, of course, their staff were really, really clued up on, making sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed, because fundamentally it was part of their jobs. If they didn't get the information right, they could fail the clinical drug trial. Hence, actually, manual application retention labels was really good in that scenario. You could trust the staff. I would suggest that the vast majority of organizations out there, it's just not going to be an adequate way of managing your retention. Unfortunately, it is the only way that you've got with E3 licenses of applying retention now. In the last 6 months, Microsoft's closed down the remaining loopholes, things like being able to use Power Automate processes or being able to into the APIs to set retention labels. Those options have gone now. They now require a higher level of licensing, meaning that with E3, your only option you have is to use manual application of retention labels, or consider the retention policies, as I mentioned before. So the downsides of manual application is significant effort for your staff, ongoing, and typically you're going to get patchy results. You're going to get some content that's simply not classified, and even that content that's classified is probably going to be hit and miss as to how accurately staff have been able to classify the content. So if we move on, the next option you've got out of the box is Trainable Classifiers. This requires either an E5 license or one of the premium bolt-ons to E3. So you've got various different governance licenses that are somewhere between E3 and E5 in cost to the organization that you can consider adding it on top of trainable classifiers. Sorry, in order to get trainable classifiers. Now, a trainable classifier is an application of AI to your content. It's allowing you to, you're getting the AI and you're trying to get it to identify a specific type of content so that it can go across your tenant and classify all of the content of that given type. So just to give you a quick rundown, you've got with trainable classifiers, you've got the ability to create a seed set. You need at least 50 files in that seed set. Now, what you're doing here is you're giving the AI these 50, could be up to 500 files, but they've all got to be of the same type. Let's say it's a policy, just to keep things simpler. You find 50 policies in your organization and you train the AI on what a policy looks like because it just looks at all of these and it assesses them and it establishes what it thinks is the commonality. Then you've got to find an even bigger training set. Your minimum of 200, it could be up to 10,000 items, but you're finding a bigger training set that the AI runs against and tests. But this training set, they're not all policies. Some of them are different types of content. And the idea is that the AI is trying to work out which ones it feels looks like policies. And you then grade the AI. You're then marking the AI and saying, yeah, you got that one right and that one right, and that, or you've messed up on that one. You've accidentally applied to a different type of content that you shouldn't have. And the AI is learning from this review process. And the more you review, the better the AI gets. So that when you then publish that trainable classifier to your tenant, it will scan across and find all of the content, well, most of the content, we'll get onto that in a bit. It will find content that meets its definition and will automatically apply the relevant retention label to it. But you can probably imagine this is situational at best. You need a significant volume of content that has the same type. So you need to have hundreds of files. In fact, I'd say thousands of files that have the same type, both for the training, but also because if you've invested hours into the training of the AI, you're going to have to actually have a very large collection of other records in your environment you want the trainable classifier to be able to find. But the big gotcha here is that middle bullet point on the screen. You see, you've only got the ability to apply a trainable classifier to content that's been created over the past 6 months. It doesn't work on your legacy digital heap. Your old content doesn't get classified. So it really works best in scenarios where you've got a large volume of content that's being generated on the fly that the trainable classifier is classifying on the fly. And I think for most organizations, this is, there's not many scenarios where you would use this, but when it's useful, it's incredibly powerful. So it's probably not the backbone of your retention architecture. Next up, we've got the sensitive information type. And the best way of thinking about this is codified application of retention. You're looking across all of the content, you're scanning inside the files inside SharePoint, let's say, and you're looking for repeated sort of codified sensitive personal information, things like passport numbers or national security numbers. And it could be bespoke codes inside your organization. Imagine you're a housing association and you've tagged your documents with a tenant ID. There could be scenarios where this is really powerful in terms of being able to identify that content reliably and consistently. The thing for me with sensitive information types is when they work, they're brilliant, but you need that codified information. Other types of personal information, such as addresses or names even, you don't pick them up with sensitive information types. And as I say in the last, yes, Maria?
I have any tips on how to tackle backlog in addition to managing new creation, as the latter is easier to do and engage with department? It's Paulina.
Managing engagements with the wider organization. Oh gosh, well, there's different approaches you can take depending on the strategy you're taking with the way that your own deadlines and your own rollout. I've often personally found questionnaires to be an ineffective strategy because you only get a certain amount of response back from a questionnaire that's sent across the organization or some form of survey in the organization, even if you're trying to encourage people as best as you can. That said, I've used them in the past to try and gather information on a broad scale. If you've got the luxury of time, having a conversation with people across the organization is by far the best approach to really understand how that specific part of the organization is functioning. And certainly I've run audit processes where you go across an organization, you've got perhaps a structured questionnaire, but you're actually doing it over a cup of coffee. But we can come back to more questions like that towards the end of the session. So going back to sensitive information types, the last bullet point here I think is particularly pertinent in that in most scenarios, I think sensitive information types are much better at applying sensitivity labels than they are at applying retention labels. You see, if something contains a passport number, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is of a specific type, you know, that file has a specific purpose or that it has a specific value to the organization, but it does mean that it contains sensitive information. I mean, sensitive information types are really designed for the US concept of PII as opposed to for the European concept of personal. So just bear that in mind when you're using them. But personally, I think as a method of applying sensitivity labels, they're superb. As a method of retention labels, potentially in the right scenario. You're probably picking up a pattern here, and it's going to be repeated with keyword query. I mean, I'm saying the same sort of thing. Sorry.
Rob, one more. With the AI, can a label be applied to a folder and then inherited by the files in the folder? Best for you to respond to that.
Not to my knowledge with an AI at the moment, Maria, but we'll get on to default labels on folders in a second and have a look at that, because I think it's a far more valuable approach.
There you go, Patricia.
Keyword query next. So you've also got a capability, again, it's with the E5 license or one of the bolt-ons to, you know, an E3. Keyword query is what it is. It's a query. You're building up a way of trying to find information based upon the nature of that information that's stored in your tenant. So for example, you could build that query up to find files that contain specific keywords or have specific phrases or have a certain content type applied to them or have been classified with particular SharePoint metadata. And you can use any combination of that. So find all of the files that happen to use the policy content type that happen to be tagged in SharePoint metadata as being in the Southwest region that also contain the word official, for example. And you would be able to build up these queries, and then off the back of them, all of the content in your tenant that matches that definition of the query could then be classified automatically with this retention label. The challenge is, of course, not only do you need to have a separate query for every type of content, a bit like all of the models we've discussed so far, you also get a large number of false positives. And what I mean by this is it's really hard to make the query the right balance of specific enough. If you make it too inclusive, you end up classifying and identifying content that really you wouldn't have wanted to apply the label to because you've made your query too broad. Whereas if you make it too specific, you end up missing a large amount of the content you really wanted to include within the query. And getting that balance right is a really difficult art. So again, as with everything else, I think this is something to consider. And in certain scenarios, it's an incredibly powerful tool, but it's probably not the backbone of your retention architecture in Microsoft 365. Which takes you on to content processing. Now, this is a bit of a bit of an aside because it requires a different license in the bottom corner, as you can see. It actually requires an additional license to use SharePoint Premium. It's a pay-as-you-go license that's in addition to your E3 or E5 license. And at the moment, it is priced at about, I believe it's 5 US cents per page that it processes. So recognize that this can get a little bit expensive. It's $5 US for a 100-page document, for example. But what this does is similar to trainable classifiers in some regards. You're using AI to scan across your environment and find content that meets a certain type of pattern. And then when you find it, you can apply retention label, sensitivity label, but it goes a bit further because it also allows you to extract metadata from that content. So one of the huge benefits of content processing, and it really is an incredible tool, one of the huge benefits is it doesn't need hundreds and hundreds of files to set up the AI this time. Instead, as a human, you put more effort into the training of the AI, so you're setting up in an appropriate way. Now, what this means is you only actually need 5 files. You have 5 examples of, say, this is what a policy looks like. And then you train the AI by saying, well, over here, I'm expecting the word contract start date. And within a couple of phrases of this contract start date, and this could be anywhere in a document, this could be on page 40 of the document, within a few words, I'm expecting to see something that is a date. And you can start building up these rules, patterns inside the document using content processing. Or you can have an image and say, in this top corner, I'm expecting a certain type of metadata to be here. But based upon the rules that you tell the AI should exist, it will be able to identify whether the type of the file it is looking at matches that definition. And if it matches, then you can use it to apply retention to it. But the real power is when you're scanning and extracting metadata from the file. Because let's say you're processing invoices, you would be able to upload dozens, hundreds of invoices. The content processing capability would be able to scan them, extract metadata from them, and also classify them with a retention label. So you'd be able to take the PO number or the invoice amount or whatever it happens to be and put them into SharePoint lists so you could start other processes or have further processing. Yes?
Yes, we have another question. This is overarching. Will the presentation be shared after, please, or maybe after your Glasgow stint?
Yes, absolutely. More than happy to share the presentation, and of course we'll get the video recording up as well so that people can find it.
Yeah,
but
maybe after the Glasgow event.
Oh yes, yeah, after the Glasgow event.
Yeah. Okay, guys, so, just to be sure as to when you'll expect it. Second question from Patricia: can the label that is applied by AI be changed manually?
Yes. So with the retention label, you've got the ability to override this and apply a different retention label if you wish to. Even with any of these approaches, you've got the ability as a user to reapply or change that label. There's a few gotchas, like you can set up record labels, the immutable variant of a retention label. You can set them up so that end users can't change the label once it's been applied, but administrators can. So there's things like that to bear in mind. But yes, as a broad measure, yes, you can, as an end user, override the AI and apply more appropriate retention labels.
Yeah. So I have several. Sorry, Rob. This is more an experience question from Kevin. Is it just me, or does SharePoint make it hard to apply metadata to documents?
I think that's subjective.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally don't find it that difficult. I think with metadata, it's much better to set default values on the libraries and folders in your structure, so that by default, just wherever the user is choosing to add their content into, it will get classified automatically. And then, just like I mentioned before, users could reclassify if there was more appropriate classification that they want to apply, but you're not relying on people classifying manually that way. Okay, I'll keep going. We'll save the rest of the questions for the end, Maria.
Okay, because there's a lot of them still. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be. I'm a bit conscious of time, you see. So,
yeah. Okay.
Okay, so the two downsides of content processing that you need to bear in mind is you need to train the AI for every different type of content that, for every time you want this model to be applied to a contract or to an invoice or to a policy, you need to train a separate model for each of them. And the second one is, it's the pay-as-you-go license. So the costs can be quite significant when you first enable it in your environment. And last but not least, this is the way that you do this. Default retention labels is, to me, by far the most effective overall solution for applying retention to your content in Microsoft 365. So again, it requires, unfortunately, a premium license, either an E5 for your staff or to have one of the compliance bolt-ons to an E3. But what you do is you across all of the libraries and potentially folders in your architecture, you pick the most relevant contextual default retention label to apply, and then all of the content that gets stored in that location gets then automatically classified with that, and then you can manually override as you need to sort of finesse, should we say, the default that's been applied. The challenge here, and it is a challenge, is you as an information management or records management professional, you absolutely need to control the architecture in your SharePoint tenant. You need to be planning that architecture. You need to be able to understand the function, shall we say, and the activity that's going on in each area of that structure so that you can apply the most relevant default label. And there's different ways of doing this. Certainly the traditional approach looks a bit like this. You know, it's something that you're probably fairly familiar with. If I went back 15 years, 20 years in SharePoint even, this is what you got. This is the sort of architecture that everyone was aiming for, where you had a hierarchy of sites and libraries, and potentially now you'd be looking at things like the SharePoint hub model as well. And you're building out this hierarchy, and hopefully you're doing it as functional as you can, because you know, organizations change structure on a regular basis. But even when you build things in that sort of incredibly functional structure, it's still going to need to be updated as the organization changes, as the activities that are being undertaken across the organization change. It works very effectively, but you've got to really, you know, plan all of this and apply default retention labels across all of the different structures inside this static hierarchy. The big gotcha, though, is it doesn't support Microsoft Teams. People generate Teams on demand. And certainly if you as an organization are seeing increased use of Microsoft Teams, this static thinking is perhaps still relevant, but it's not going to be the only way that you're applying an architecture inside your environment. Instead, many organizations are moving to a dynamic architecture first and foremost. This is one based upon request process, where there is some form of questions asked around the context of a new team or a new SharePoint site that are captured probably in a request form of some description. These are submitted into a creation process where the site is created and configured, could be manual, could be automatic, and these are pushed out as new sites and SharePoint, you know, Microsoft Teams and SharePoint sites that are given back to the wider organization. But the important part here is that you are applying your configuration, your structures to each of those different types of sites that are created. So, for example, you might have a template specifically to support the way that you run projects that has a structure that supports those projects. And perhaps against that structure, I don't know, you might have a project budgets. Let's call it a library, it could be a channel. And against that project budget, you might set a default retention label of, say, 7 years because it's financial information. But you might have a project final report structure, and you would set a default retention label potentially that's a bit longer in line with your retention schedule. So the benefit of a dynamic structure is you're almost defining the cookie cutter that's going to roll out these workspaces in a consistent way going forwards. And any sort of repeated process in the organization, this works so much better for things like the recruitment process or the procurement process or the employee record, anything that's got a life cycle, a start, middle, and an end. Dynamic architectures really are more appropriate, and anything using a Microsoft team is the way to go. So what I'm noticing is that while many organizations still build these static structures, I don't think many organizations can avoid needing a dynamic structure. So your choice isn't really which one of these two shall I go for. It's really, you either need both or you go just dynamic as an organization. And many organizations I've been working with over the past few years have gone with this purely dynamic approach. And this is the point that I'd normally wrap up a presentation like this and say, well, I hope you've all enjoyed yourself. I hope you've all learned something new. You know, I've answered the question of how can we reliably apply retention across SharePoint and Teams. You set default retention labels and you have some form of architecture, probably dynamic, that is controlling the application of retention across those workspaces. Pat myself on the back and walk away. But it's not quite as simple as that. You see, I've always been left with a slightly bad taste in my mouth whenever I've concluded a presentation like that, because I know that that just opens up an even bigger challenge for many organizations. How on earth can I convince people to buy into this vision? Because what you've just said, Rob, is all well and good, but it's incredibly expensive. You know, to build a dynamic structure for most organizations, you're talking hundreds and thousands of pounds. In most cases, you're talking £250,000 or more. You know, it's not a cheap thing. You know, but it's something that you need. This is something that every council, every police force, every charity, you know, across multiple sectors, if you're going to apply sensible records management to your environment, you absolutely need some form of architecture, a bit like this, that's going to consistently apply retention to your content. And having worked with many organizations, large organizations who have been able to be in a fortunate position where they could afford the investment in this area, I found myself building this same dynamic architecture over and over again in the last few years. It started me thinking, what can I do? How can I make this more affordable for other people who don't have this big upfront budget? And this is really why I want to introduce you all to Orinoco. Orinoco 365 is my baby. Over the past few years, I've had a team of developers and testers, hidden away. I've not been speaking about this publicly. This is the very first time I'm speaking about this publicly. And Orinoco is something that I've had that team build. It's effectively that dynamic architecture in a box, designed specifically with all of the best learnings that I've had from all the organizations I've worked with to bundle them all in together into a single low-cost SaaS offering, or as low cost as I can make it. But I know what you're thinking at this stage too. I feel a bit like a mind reader on this presentation. You see, we've heard it all before, Rob. There's lots of records management products out there. There's, I'm not going to name any of them, but we're all aware there's loads of companies out there that are offering records management capabilities that extend Microsoft 365, that make it easier to manage records. But Orinoco is fundamentally different. Let me try and explain. You see, all of the other records management products, the way that they work is a bit like this. You have your content inside your Microsoft 365 tenant, and the vendor provides a separate database up in the cloud, and they've got some scanning capabilities that are listening in to Microsoft 365. So as new content is changed in your tenant and uploaded, they're listening in and they're automatically extracting that information about that. They're adding an extra row into a database in their storage. And this, as you can imagine, immediately presents large risks to you. This means that there is a copy of all of your data being held outside of your tenant. You've got to absolutely fundamentally trust that vendor with the way that they're securing your information, because it's no longer in your control. You're also sort of trapped a little bit because all of your retention is applied to that data up in their engine. They very often have rules-based engines that identify how long a specific file or record needs to be retained for, and all of that logic is stored in their data. Meaning that if you ever decide to stop paying them, you lose all of that retention. You lose the knowledge of, say, a specific file is 7 years through a 12-year retention period. That goes, unless you start thinking about some form of expensive migration of the retention logic, which I don't even know if it would be possible. It would depend on which vendor you've gone with, but you're sort of a bit trapped into this architecture as soon as you go down with any other records management product. And of course, the cost is expensive. In fact, let me rephrase. I would describe these costs as quite eye-watering, very large ongoing license fees, and it's mostly related to the fact that they've got a great big large database to store with millions of rows in it relating to all of your information. So this is why Orinoco is fundamentally different. Essentially, we don't in Orinoco have that database. What we're doing instead is, we're not storing any of your data outside of your own Microsoft 365 tenant. It's all in your SharePoint and Teams. You don't have that risk of having a third-party vendor storing information on your behalf. It's so much more secure from that perspective. Instead, what we're doing is we're providing effectively that dynamic architecture in a box. You get the ability to make requests into an engine that's hosted in Orinoco, where we configure the workspaces for you based upon the information you provide us from your tenant. And we reach back into your tenant and we give you the SharePoint sites and the Microsoft Teams configured the way you need them to be, complete with all the labels and retention, and specifically your default retention labels get automatically applied to the structures that we create. But it's not just the retention. We're setting your content types, your views, your permissions, your navigation experiences. We're doing all of this dynamically for you. But nice, because this means that all of your retention rules are being stored inside your tenant using the out-of-the-box Microsoft Purview capabilities. What we're doing is helping you align with Purview, get a better return on your existing investment because you're getting to use some of these capabilities that perhaps you're only partially using at the moment. And of course, it means you're not tied into us. Or, you know, if you leave the service, you just leave the ability to create new requests, but all of your content is still there in your tenant with no migration, with its retention applied in situ. And because we don't have that big database, it's much more affordable for you as well. And of course, now speaking as IntelliJ rather than Orinoco, we can help you configure Orinoco to best support your own specific needs. So understand your ways of working, the types of workspaces, the type of retention, metadata, permissions, etc. that you need to apply. It's very flexible, very configurable. Anyway, I'd just like to thank you all for the feedback you provided in the poll before. That was really useful stuff, and I'll work with Maria on see if we can put together future webinars that perhaps we don't mention Orinoco in, but are focused on helping you with some of these other challenges that you've mentioned as being priorities for you inside the Microsoft 365. I'd just like to mention the RMS Summit at this point as well. So, another plug for the RMS. Really, if you are not a member already, consider joining. But the RMS this May is putting on a one-day summit directly after conference in Brighton, and it's going to be on these sorts of topics. Focusing upon the information management capability, conversation within Microsoft 365 around AI and around records management and the wider governance piece. And it's got some of the world's best speakers all coming together for that one-day event. So I urge you all to take a look at the RMS Summit and consider coming along and joining us at that show. But lastly, on an Orinoco perspective, you can probably tell I'm really excited by this. It's a really fun thing for me to finally be able to talk about this publicly. We've had this available now with multiple clients over the last 6 months, and I've not been, proactively marketing over that time. But it has proven itself to be incredibly robust. It's provisioned more than 10,000 sites and teams into production environments for our clients already that they're using on a daily basis. This QR code that you can see up on the screen here will take you directly through to the ability to register for a private demo that we're putting together for any parties that are interested in finding out more. And feel free to visit our website and contact our sales team if you want more information. But anyway, Maria, I'll hand back over to you. Are there any more questions in the chat?
There's loads. There's loads. I don't know where to start. I mean, there's such a long stream of this. This is what we'll do. Yeah.
I will take those questions, Maria. Any we can't answer in the remaining, we've got 12 minutes. Any we can't answer, I'm more than happy to try and blog about this. I think I've done this in the past. It's a bit of a commitment for me. It might take me several months because I'm relatively busy, but I'll try my best to give sensible answers to the questions that have been captured here today.
That'd be very good. But what I wanted to say as well is go off mute and ask Rob right now. It's our usual dynamic community that's here. So there's a lot of interactions on it. So please, guys, go off mute and ask Rob directly, because there's a lot that. Anybody? I don't.
It's a challenge in a scenario like this with hundreds of people.
Yeah.
Are there any questions in the Q&A you want to bring to my attention while we're waiting to see if anyone comes off mute or in the chat? I hope that was of some use to some of you. Let me just see. Do people use content types widely? So content types are still an essential part of the Microsoft 365 architecture. You absolutely need to use content types. I would suggest that from my experience, people don't tend to change content types though. So there was a really big push about 15 years ago where content types were the future. They were going to solve all of the problems. You'd go to the new menu in SharePoint, you'd click on the drop-down list, you'd pick the relevant content type, perhaps there'd be a template applied to your content, and you would be off and going and starting to edit that file straight away. But the reality is that people don't create files through the share button, through the new button in SharePoint that often. They tend to go to Word or Excel, and they tend to start their documents off and then upload them when they need to save them to a relevant SharePoint site or into a Microsoft team. And the problem with this approach is whatever your default content type is on the environment, on that particular library, is the one that file is going to inherit. So yes, you absolutely need content types, but probably I would suggest you're rarely going to get staff who are changing the content types or using the new menu sufficiently for you to have too many. I tend to use just a one-to-one match, so one content type per library, and then have consistent metadata being applied through the content type model in that mechanism.
Found my bearings with the question. So on content processing, can you also use it for sensitivity labels in addition to retention labels? And does content processing go over legacy content?
Yes, to both. So you can use it for both retention labels and sensitivity labels. And yes, you can certainly when you enable it, you can choose the scope inside your tenant of which areas the tenant is going to apply the model to. So you could push it out just to one library, or you could push it out wide, but it doesn't have the time limit that the trainable classifier has. So it goes across everything. So you can probably imagine as soon as you enable it, it's going to start scanning and processing. You can choose whether you want it to rescan and reapply its processing to other content as that content changes. So that's something to consider. That will obviously increase the price, but as content changes its composition in your environment, it might well need to be reclassified appropriately because it might fall under a different model in theory.
Yep. And a question about content processing being available on E5. Definitely. Yeah, I'd rather you answer.
Yeah. Well, it's a bolt-on license. Whether you're on E3 or E5, content processing is a pay-as-you-go license in addition. And there's a whole bunch of different pay-as-you-go licenses for different parts of content process. Really, what you've got there is the SharePoint Premium family is a whole bunch of disparate tools that I think people in this room really should be aware of. There are tools there that are coming out all the time from Microsoft, such as the ability to have automated e-signatures. And coming out very soon, over the next few months, there's the capability to start doing some form of redaction of content, which I'm really excited for, but I haven't seen yet. So, it might well be exactly what we're looking for when we're doing some form of sensitivity review as part of our disposition review process. I'm not going to say that it is or isn't because I've not seen it. I want to see it before I promise that. But there's a whole bunch of really powerful. Think of SharePoint Premium as almost your advanced document management capabilities, but with the extra licensing cost that comes with them.
But that's demonstrated with Priva as well. The redaction bit. Is this still outstanding? Default retention labels don't work with move copy of documents.
Default retention labels still don't work with move copy. So moving is a painful process. Obviously, if you don't have the retention label set up in the location you're moving it to, then yes, of course, it won't move across. I believe our friends at Cohasset did an amazing study in what happens in moving a year or so ago. Any of you that are IRMS members might well have come along to some of those sessions and seen the scenarios where the moving works or doesn't work in different situations when it comes to retention.
Okay, also not when drag and dropping into a site from desktop. Okay, I am struggling to get more questions out of that, but again, it's our usual engaged audience in the IMTech community, and very, very grateful for everybody. I know that there is a product in the end. However, Rob has always been a very informative speaker for all our engagements, whether you're the CAB working group or whether you're attending one of the sessions that we have. Rob has always been very helpful to the community as well, and will continue to be. So I think we've got 5 minutes to wrap up the IMTech Summit. Guys, please do come. And if you need a discount code that we have, I think I have communicated with everybody. But if you need a discount code for it, please reach out to myself, Rob, or Ren Lemming, so we could give you one. There is a time limited one that we have been issued by the organizers as well.
Superb. So are there any other questions, or should we wrap up there, Maria?
Yep, I think it's time for us to wrap up. So in terms of the video, oh, here we go.
Chris?
Can retention labels account for different trigger points, or is it set from date of creation on or similar? Some of our retention periods start from closure of cases. Rob, trigger
Yes,
point.
so yeah, there's different ways of triggering retention labels. You've got, with an E5 license or one of the premium licenses, there's actually multiple triggers. You've got the ability to trigger the start of retention when from a date modified, from the last time that file was modified by a user or changed by a user. You can start retention from the date the file was first created. You've also got the ability to start it from the date the label was first applied to the file. And I think most specifically to the question that's coming in, you've got the concept of event-based retention with retention labels with the premium license with an E5 or one of the bolt-ons. Now, event-based retention is a little bit tricky. I've used it with various clients in production scenarios. What you need is to make sure you're capturing two bits of information. Both you need to apply the retention label to the specific record, but you also need to apply another bit of metadata too. And this other bit of metadata is, think of it as the instance of what you're applying with the retention label. So imagine your retention label is project. You're going to want a bit of metadata that says this is project 123, or this is project alpha, or this is project beta. You're going to want to identify which project. And then when the project closes, you trigger an event in Purview and you pass in, say, both bits of information. You say, find me all the information that's classified with this retention label that's also classified with this bit of SharePoint metadata. And that triggers the event at that point in activity. Now, the more dynamic you can make this link up process, if you like, for triggering events, the better. So, for example, I worked with one organization, it was actually in higher education organization, and they needed event-based retention around their academic year. So we could actually automate the application of that process by setting default metadata to tag all of the content that was created in their tenant with a specific academic year. So, you know, academic year 2022-23, for example. And we have a scheduled process that wakes up at the 1st of September and automatically says, right, okay, it's a new academic year. Let's change the default metadata across all these different libraries, yes, so that the content that's created from this morning onwards gets tagged with the new academic year. And this means that same process that wakes up on the beginning of September can automatically then say, right, okay, let's trigger an event for all of the content from a previous academic year, because now, you know, it's reached the end of the academic year. So you could do this with anything that's got a sort of ending process. Could be a staff member leaving the organization, could be a tenant leaving a tenancy agreement, a property being sold, whatever it happens to be. But if you really need to think about how you hook it into existing processes, because if it's too manual, you'll find that event-based retention labels triggering the events becomes a bit burdensome for your admins to be able to keep up with.
Yeah, that's the most common one. And the other one is when children reach the age of majority, for those who are in that space. But there is an overarching question. I'm new to the KIM space. Do you have any advice on where I should start to understand the basics first?
Well, there's lots of different ways you can get into it. It can be quite confusing. I would suggest that you might want to speak to people who understand what they're talking about in this area. There's various training partners out there that can provide sort of guidance and steps. We have a whole bunch of IRMS training partners that you can have a look at, because they provide training programs specifically targeted on helping people with information management needs. You can certainly reach out to people who have expertise in this area as well and ask them direct questions. And there's many people out there, you know, myself included, I'm happy to answer questions if they're thrown at me. Erica Tully works for Microsoft. She's written a great book that you can find. I believe last time I looked, it was in Amazon. And that book's a really good read on all of the different retention capabilities that Microsoft provides. But just beware, it's an evergreen process. Microsoft keeps updating things. So Erica keeps having to update that book behind the scenes, but there's various different sources.
So I think overarchingly, in terms of advisory, the things that you need to settle first in terms of the basic things is your baseline. Your baseline is, what do you need to do as a KIM practitioner? So be very aware of what you need to adhere to, what you need to go through as a KIM practitioner. So that is the records management space. Now, once that is clear in your head, then you start introducing the technology. And there's a lot of information that's available to the technology. And Rob has mentioned that as well. Because don't go to the technology first and be driven by it to do your records management. It has to be the other way around. We've always said that you need to make sure that you're clear on what you need to do in your organization and in your role before bringing in the technology, which needs to adjust to what you need to do. And with that, we are 1 minute over, and thank you, everyone. You guys are always a wonderful audience, and we will always try to give you all of these informative things. There's still a lot of plan, but Rob, Ren, David, everybody is going to be a part of it. We're happy from your support, and we look forward to more support from you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.